Zorgamazoo, chapter 19 and 20. So remember at the very end, they got back to Earth and the magical creatures went back home. And then remember that crabby Mrs. Crabone, who takes care of Katrina Cottrell, said that she changed her ways and she wasn't wicked or anything. And then perhaps it would be a new start. She held out her arms to hug her. Okay, say goodbye to your brain. Katrina, however, had made a mistake. Old Krabby's compunction was utterly fake. I knew it. I thought so. Gotcha, she cried with a snatch and a grab, with a pinch and a pull like a claw and a crab. Things only got worse, I'm afraid to report. Oh, see, so there's Krabby, and I bet that's that doctor who was going to do a lobotomy. When out of the murk came a snickering snort, it was followed by figures, and each of them foul. Wait a minute. Oh, report. Things only got worse, I'm afraid to report. When out of the murk came a snickering snort, it was followed by figures, each of them foul. They surrounded Katrina like wolves on the prowl. Katrina, hello there, said Dr. LaFang. Look who we met, such a nice little gang. Katrina looked left, Katrina looked right. Both sides held an equally worrying sight. There was the ruffian, sickly Van Puke, his nose spilling over with gobbledygook. Selina the Slash was waiting as well, to exact her revenge on Katrina Cottrell. And those two, of course, were never without Bugsy McCrook, that unbearable lout. He was wearing a typical simpering leer. He took a step forward and said with a sneer, "You're weird little pals. They ain't here anymore, so I'd say it's time that we settled the score." In seconds, the villains were closing the gap. It was clear she had been caught in a terrible trap. Selina and Sickly snuck up from the rear. They captured Katrina by elbow and ear. They twisted her arms, holding her tight, while Dr. LaFang stood off to the right. In his hand were the blades of his wicked device, especially made to puncture and slice. In the lamplight it flashed with a sinister gleam, like the teeth of a beast in a hideous dream. He raised up his mincer, holding it tight. "I shall enter," he said, "just here." No, holding it high. "I shall enter," he said, "right here by your eye. So don't move a muscle or you may feel some pain, because now, my dear girl, say goodbye to your brain." "Stop!" came a voice. It came from the street. It seemed to rise up from under their feet. A manhole popped open and clamoring out came Morty himself like a flowering spout. "Hey, gimwits," he said, "whatever you planned, you'd better just quit it. Do you understand?" This time, however, the gang was prepared. Bugsy was grinning. He didn't look scared. "So it's you again, is it?" he said with a sneer. "Well, listen, I'll make myself perfectly clear. You frightened us once, way back in our den, but trust me, you freak, you won't do it again." Bugsy stepped forward, the head of the gang, and so did that lunatic, Dr. LaFang. He was staring at Morty, or rather his head. "What a curious beast," he excitedly said. "How I would certainly love to obtain such a wholly unique and unusual brain." "Well, sorry," said Morty, "to mess up your plot, but I'm using my brain, believe it or not. And Bugsy, you're no longer frightened of me? Well, how about my friend? He's as big as a tree." All of a sudden, everything shook, including the nerves of Bugsy McCrook. The buildings, the cars, and even the street went thwompa thwomp to a wampling beat. The behemoth, of course, that voluminous chap whose footfalls were each like a thundering clap, stepped into the alley, his hands on his hips. He was looking half-starved. He was licking his lips. "I'm famished," he boomed, surveying the scene, "and I love eating folks who are nasty and mean. Their blood is so salty, their liver's so firm. Whenever you eat them, they wiggle and squirm. Their skin has a scent like the stinkiest cheese, and their heads, they go pop like the plumpest of peas. You can bake them in pastry to make a souffle, or perhaps For dessert, a mini parfait. Whichever the case, I chew them to pulp. I guzzle them down with a slurp and a gulp. Well then, said Morty, a smile on his face, let me tell you, my friend, you're in just the right place. Bugsy McCrook and the rest of the gang, and Mrs. Crabone and Dr. LaFang, they didn't stand gaping for even a flash. Instead, they ran off in a blundering dash. The behemoth, meanwhile, that insatiable brute, he chased them away in the romping pursuit. Come back here, he cried, you sumptuous bums. At least let me nibble your fingers and thumbs. But they didn't come back. They were brisk, they were brusque. They went scampering off in the darkening dusk, weeping like babies and shaking like leaves, wiping their snot on the ends of their sleeves. As they ran, all you heard were their pitiful moans, for the fear in their hearts had spread into their bones. Their running was clumsy, with twitches and hops, as they stumbled and bumbled in blundering flops, wailing and whining and yelping, and then they were gone. They weren't even heard from again. Turning to Morty, Katrina said, Hey, you know something, Mort? You just saved the day. That's pretty heroic. It's terribly brave. What a very adventurous way to behave. Aw, shucks, Morty said. Well, maybe you're right. You could say I put up a pretty good fight. Or maybe not me, he said with a smirk. I suppose the behemoth did most of the work. Besides, if whatever you're saying is true, any courage I showed, I learned it from you. Katrina was flattered, but she didn't agree. No, Morty, she said, it wasn't from me. If we're speaking of courage, you got it all wrong. You're just like your pop. It was there all along. No words could make Morty feel better than those. He was pleased from his horns to the tips of his toes. Katrina, however, felt sullen and low, recalling again she had nowhere to go. She looked up at Morty and then looked away. In her heart, she wanted to ask him to stay, but instead she looked down, her chin on her chest. It's over, she thought. It's the end of our quest. She looked up again and thought with a smile, but maybe I'll visit him once in a while. Now wait, Morty said, there's no need to be glum. You ought to remember I'm always your chum. Then he chuckled a bit. I should really have known you'd end up in a jam if I left you alone. So listen, Katrina, come live underground, under the streets where us Zorgals are found. Katrina was pleased. She nodded her head. I'd like that, she whispered. It was all that she said. Well, great, Morty beamed. In that case, let's go. Let me show you my home in the tunnels below. I can see it already, you and me and my pop. That's the first place we'll go, to the hospital shop. So we better get moving. It's already late because visiting hours are over at 8. Dawn, dawn, dawn. Chapter 20. The rest of their days. I love the beginning of the chapters. Okay. Bortleby Yorgel lay under the street, or more to the point, he lay under a sheet, tucked in like a child from his chin to his heels, in a bed that could travel on 4 little wheels. So yes, he was cozy, but sick to his bones. His words, when he spoke, were like pitiful groans. His pallor was pale, he was barely alive. His doctors were certain he wouldn't survive. But when he saw Morty step into his room, the pink of his cheeks came back into bloom. Pop, Morty gushed and ran to his side. This adventure we had was one heck of a ride. He started recounting the tale to his pop, who silently gestured for Morty to stop. I already know, said his pop with a laugh. I heard the good news on my radiograph. You bravely set off, and when you were through, you rescued the Zorgals of Zorgamazoo. Well, yes, Morty said, the Zorgals and more. There were also all sorts of creatures from legend and lore. There were thousands of others we rescued as well, all thanks to Katrina Cottrell. And so she came in. She stood by the wall. All along she'd been waiting just out in the hall. She came forward, approaching old Bortleby's bed. It's an honor to finally meet you, she said. Bartleby groaned, he shifted his weight, he coughed, and his throat seemed to rumble and grate. His lungs made a noise like a wheeze or a whine. The honor, he sputtered, is entirely mine. Katrina was blushing. She looked at her feet, and soon she was nearly as red as a beet. Please, sir, she said, I hope you can see that Morty's as much of a hero as me. He saved me not once, but actually twice. He's given me constant support and advice. He's taught me that sometimes you'll land in a jam when you're hasty and brash in the way that I am, and I think that I've learned that life can be rough if you're overly drawn to adventuring stuff. But that's what I love, an adventurous quest. In some ways, I know I'm sort of obsessed. Not Morty, mind you. He hates having thrills. If he'd had his choice, he'd have run for the hills, but that's not what he did. No Mortimer stayed, in spite of the fact he was clearly afraid. In that way, I think he's different from me. In that way, he's braver than I'll ever be. I guess what I mean, I think you could say that Morty's the #1 hero today. Bartleby smiled. He's a hero, it's true. It's something, you see, I already knew. Wincing with pain, he looked up at his son. In my eyes, he whispered, he's second to none. Bartleby beckoned with a quavering hand. Now both of you listen, you must understand. Soon I'll be gone. I'll cash in my chips. My very last breath will pass over my lips. And son, after that, you'll be all alone. You'll be just like Katrina. You'll be on your own. Adventures, however, turn strangers to kin, and kin stick together in thickest and thin. So I want you to promise, I want you to vow, you'll look after each other. You're like family now. Katrina leaned forward. She nodded her head. We know what you mean, and we promise, she said. Pop? Morty asked. Hey, Pop, you okay? But his Pop didn't move in that bed where he lay. Had it happened, thought Morty? Had it finally come? Just to think it made Morty feel utterly numb. But then Bartleby smiled, just the tiniest grin, a smile that belied a great glowing within. I'm proud of you, son, he happily sighed, and then Bartleby Yorgle, he quietly died. Don't worry, my reader, no need to be sad. A death isn't always entirely bad. Among Zorgles, for instance, a life that is long is the life best remembered with dancing and song. Any Zorgledom funeral bubbles with fun when the life before death was a jovial one, and since Bartleby died so delightfully old, his interment was hardly unhappy or cold. Instead, it was bursting with music and mirth, celebrating his life from the day of his birth. His casket was spangled in ribbons and flags, and streamers emblazoned with ziggles and zags. They flapped like his coffin was carried away up to Zorgamazoo on the following day. The guests in attendance had gathered around a great swelling of earth, the burial mound. And oh, what a crowd! 1,000 or more, and not only Zorgles, but creatures galore. When they heard it was Bartleby Yorgle who died, they came from all corners, from far and from wide. The Yetis arrived with the dragons and elves, and the ogres, of course, who came by themselves. There were flubbery creatures from various locks, and phoenixes flaming in flurrying flocks. Winnie as well, she came with her clans from the cliffs that encompass the Wendigo lands. There was even the magical Gilly-Galoo, and of course every Zorgle from Zorgamazoo. Every creature he'd met, every singular beast, they all had arrived for the funeral feast. Although Morty was saddened and stricken with grief, his feelings of sorrow were thankfully brief. When he saw all the people his father had known, he realized at once that he wasn't alone. They were all the same creatures. He'd met them as well in the course of his quest with Katrina Cottrell. These were his friends. They had come by the ton. They'd been passed, so it seemed, from father to son. So wiping a tear from the edge of his eye, Morty rose from his seat. He straightened his tie. He then began singing the eulogy song with everyone dancing and singing along. Later, when evening had come to a close, the guests all departed for rest and repose. Having paid their respects, they gently withdrew to the huts and cabins of Zorgamazoo. In one little cottage just out of the way, made of thatches of bramble and timber and clay, and built in a tree that was ample and wide, a trio of friends were relaxing inside. In one chair a Zorgal curled up in his coat, a weather-worn necktie adorning his throat. The second, a creature all hairy with curls that were pale like the shimmer of elegant pearls. The third of the trio, the oddest of all, wasn't hairy or scary and not very tall, just a regular girl, no less and no more, but the sort of a girl who you couldn't ignore, a girl you would think was imagining things like pirates and gadgets and creatures and kings. They each had a cushion, a comfortable seat. They were having some cocoa and something to eat. They were curled by the fire with blankets as well, Winnie and Morty and Katrina Cottrell. So now, as we come to the end of my text, I'll tell you a little of what happened next. Winnie returned to her family clans, to the bats and the balls and the roar of the fans. After all, her first love, as I'm sure you will recall, is that wonderful game they call Zorgally Ball. She went back to the fields where she usually played, to stadiums dappled with sun and with shade, to the places where often she walloped and swung in the bush leagues with Cyril Zip Zorgal de Young. Morty, meanwhile, he also went back. He returned to his job as a newspaper hack. Rejoining the crew at the Rumor Review, he typed up the saga of Zorgamazoo. Each week a new chapter would go to the press, and the story became a resounding success. People who read it were rather amazed. In addition, the telling was critically praised. And no matter who read it, from toddler and tyke to queasy old geezers and wheezers alike, any reader at all, in spite of their years, had enchantium gas coming out of their ears. For with all Zorgal stories, for better or worse, the whole of the telling was written in verse. Some called it madness, others called it sublime, for he penned the whole story completely in rhyme. And the tale, my good reader, you must understand, is the same one you're holding right now in your hand. And what of Katrina Cottrell? That story perhaps is too lengthy to tell. She travels the world on adventures galore. She went roaming all over, had so many more. On all of them, Morty was there at her side. It seemed he was always along for the ride, on travels and treks that would always amaze. The two would be friends for the rest of their days. Days that were spent in a world of surprise, a world in which phoenixes lit up the skies, a world of more wonder than ever before, where pixies were back in the cracks in the floor, where serpents and mermaids were back in the seas, and ogres went loping through forests and trees. The world where mysterious creatures were found in tunnels meandering under the ground, or on mountains above us, or deep in the grass, a world, all a whirl with enchantium gas. That's it, my good reader. My story is done. And my, what a strange and mysterious one. But that was the story I wanted to tell, the story of me and Katrina Cottrell. And so, my good reader, or perhaps my good friend, we have come to the finish, the curtain, the end. Dun, dun.